Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Aisha Abdullah. I am the Open Education Project Manager for Spark, and I'm also a member of the Open Education Association Steering Committee. So, thank you all so much for joining this webinar, Beyond Echo Chambers, Bringing Open Education to New Audiences, which is hosted by the Open Education Association. I am joining you from Maryland, where allergy season is in full blast and it's terrible. So if I cough or sneeze while I'm talking for 30 seconds, please, please forgive me. So, for a little background before we get started, the Open Education Association is a relatively new organization that launched late last year and is really focused on laying the groundwork for a coordinated and sustainable future for open education by building infrastructure, relationships, resources, and programming that's really dedicated to strengthening collaboration and expanding access to knowledge for all. So at this time, we are focused on the United States as well as higher education, and it is an individual membership organization. However, we welcome a lot of different pathways to be involved, and whether you are in the US or not, or in higher education or not, we welcome you to attend our events and use our resources. So we have like a wonderful list of resources on our website, as well as webinars like this one, which is open to everyone. So we encourage you to visit our website for upcoming events, publish community resources, and learn more about how to become a member. And I will share all those links with you in the chat in just a second. So for this webinar, it's about 1 hour long, and the first half will be a presentation, and the second half we will be joined by an amazing few panelists. And we strongly encourage you throughout this webinar to be vocal in the chat, share your experiences, ask a lot of questions, and we will have time at the end to answer them. So this webinar is recorded and it will be shared shortly after today. So with that, I'm going to pass it on over to our presenter, Lindsay.
Thanks, Aisha. And it's so nice to see so many familiar faces and so many new faces joining us today. Hello, my name is Lindsay Gavush. I use she, her pronouns. I am currently the Assistant Dean of Libraries at the Community College of Rhode Island. That's where I am located. I also serve as the Fellow for Open Education with the New England Board of Higher Ed, which is in Boston, Massachusetts. I am a doctoral student at the University of Rhode Island. I'm studying how identity plays a role in open pedagogy. And I am also a mother of three, and I am a partner in crime to my husband, Ryan. We enjoy gardening. He likes to say that he plants the food and I plant the mood. I love to grow flowers. And I'm really excited to talk about this topic today, and maybe just to give a little context of maybe my experience in this, kind of moving outside of the echo chambers of open ed. As a fellow with the New England Board of Higher Ed, I have the privilege to work with my colleagues at the other three compacts in the US. And one of the things we noticed a few years ago, we were presenting a lot at the Open Education Conference, kind of year after year, and started to feel like we were in an echo chamber and really wanted to explore other pathways to getting our messaging out. And because the compacts historically have shown up in spaces outside of open ed, we decided to pursue that. So we started applying to conferences like the SHIO conference and other spaces in post-secondary ed to just kind of help our community, our open education community, make some inroads in spaces that we don't always get invited to. So that's what brings us here today. And just to give you a quick overview of what I'm going to cover, because we do, like Aisha said, we have an incredible group of panelists coming up at the end. So I think we'll get to a lot of things I may have talked about, but we'll be talking about it with our panelists. So, but I really wanted to work off of one of the association's strategic directions, which is, reaching key audiences. So we will be talking about, why and how do we move our passion for open education outside of these echo chambers that is our community. So if you've ever attended the Open Education Conference or maybe OE Global or maybe one of your regional conferences, you know that warm, fuzzy feeling you get when you show up and you see and connect with others who are also so committed to removing barriers in the curriculum for our students, whether those are financial barriers or cultural barriers. Um, because you see, as a practitioner, you see on a day-to-day basis how open, positively impacts the student experience. Um, but what happens, when you find yourself in not one of those safe spaces and you do have an opportunity to connect with a decision maker? What are the considerations? What should you think about? Um, Hint, one of the big themes of today, you'll quickly recognize is that we always really need to have a good sense of who our audience is. And I think that kind of goes without saying. We talk a lot about that in the open ed community as it is. Like, we need to be able to pivot between talking to students and talking to faculty and talking to administrators. Um, so today I want to talk about the people and places outside of the echo chamber. I want to quickly touch on the importance of networking. And last but not least, like I mentioned before, we'll transition to the panel portion of today's discussion and have a conversation with three individuals who are really well versed in moving this work forward outside of the open ed communities. I think we talk a lot in open education about the human side of education, which is the people. That's what we care about. That's why we're so passionate. That's what we're committed to. So let's start there with the people. Um, and I hope you like the bright color scheme. I was really needing some happiness today. I hope it's making you smile. I see a little heart from Amanda. So I've listed a few kind of groups of folks that I often think about having conversations with. And like I mentioned before, how I strategically think about pivoting between these different groups of people, because they all have different goals, priorities, strategic initiatives. But I think, one of the most accessible, give or take, I think is the senior leaders. So if you're at an institution or in a system, those are the people we are sometimes physically the closest to have conversations with, to move outside of the open ed community. These are some of our key stakeholders. So I think it's important to recognize that, or as an administrator myself, I can assure you that these folks are not directly thinking about open. And that's not because they don't care. It's because they are inundated with other priorities. I think, especially in today's landscape in higher ed, they are not only dealing with pressing issues like retention and student mental health, they are constantly navigating the nuances of executive orders being, just churned out, and how are they going to navigate them. So it's not that they don't care, they just have a lot on their plates. Basically, that's what it comes down to. So how can we really grasp their strategic initiatives and what they care about and what their priorities are, and how can we work our passion for open into those spaces? So I think my biggest takeaway with senior leadership for everyone to recognize is that timing, it really is everything. I think it's important to respect the load and responsibility of senior administrators. Just showing that respect will go a long way. We can advocate without being pushy, right? So sometimes we might feel the urgency coming down on us on open. So maybe inclusive access is coming to your campus. So you genuinely feel that sense of urgency. Like, we need to act now. I need to talk to the provost now. Yes, and change might not happen now. Inclusive access might come to campus now, and we can still have conversations that are meaningful and that move this work forward simultaneously. And we might have an opportunity to change things it's all about relationship building and timing. I give this example, or I've given this example a few times recently, so apologies if you've heard it. But course marking is something that we've been working on at NEBI, at the New England Board of Higher Ed. We've been working with institutions in New England to implement course marking so students can register for courses and see right away what courses are using either free or low cost materials. And I have been trying to get course marking at my institution for a while. I've been bringing it up to our VPAA. I've been bringing it up to my dean, and trying to help them understand why it's important, and wasn't really going anywhere. And then I just happened to be in a meeting one day, and our vice president for student enrollment um, asked me about OER, and he said something like, "Hey, wouldn't it be cool if students could see like which courses we're using OER? Like, could you figure that out?" And I said, "I already have that list." And I said it would be really cool if we could put it into Banner. And he said, "I can make that happen. Send it to me." And with one follow-up email, boom, course marking off the ground. And I wasn't even, it's not even something that I felt was an appropriate time to bring it up. It just happened to fall into my lap. I knew my talking points. I was prepared with the list. I sent the follow-up email. So that's like a good example of like sometimes you just have to sit back and wait. And sometimes you might get a no at first, but it doesn't mean that opportunities won't come forward. Moving on to policymakers, I think it's really important to always, if you find yourself in having the opportunity to connect with any kind of policymaker, um, have have your talking points ready, obviously, but go even further and have a one pager. Depending on who you may be encountering and what you're looking to move forward, have just, a really visually nice one pager that shows them things that they care about. It goes a long way. They can take it with them, they can read it, if they take the train, sitting down in their office, whatever. They have it in front of them. It's a nice visual reminder for them. Um, I recently was able to meet with the commissioner of post-secondary education in Rhode Island. I kept pushing for a meeting, kept emailing. It kept getting postponed. I was getting a little discouraged, but at the same time, taking my own advice and saying, this person has a lot on their plate, and the opportunity will likely come at some point. And it did. And I got, a 20-minute meeting. I gave my spiel. I did my research the night before the call and made sure I knew exactly what their priorities were. I knew ahead of time that the commissioner's office was working with the governor on Rhode Island's 2030 plan. I knew there was a section in there about career and technical education, which specifically named removing barriers to offer programs that meet students and employer needs. And I knew where OER fit in there. And so I went into that conversation just having my talking points, knowing what he cared about and how it could connect with what I cared about, which was removing these barriers for our students. And in that conversation, I'm not talking about academic freedom there, right? I'm not talking about copyright or Creative Commons. I am positioning OER as an affordability measure, as well as one that the research suggests supports multiple student and institutional success metrics, because I know that's what he cares about, and I know that's what his office is working on. And just going back quickly to the senior leadership, have a one pager for them too. I met with my new vice president for academic affairs last month. She's brand new to my institution, and I had a 30-minute intro meeting with her, and I went in there with my one pager. It's actually double-sided, so sneaky me, it's 2 pages. But at the end of my meeting, I had shared a little bit about open, but that's not my full job. So, but at the end, I said, "Hey, I'd really like you to take a look at this." It just covers a little bit more extensively the research that supports how open can benefit our students. And she thanked me and we went on our way. And a few days later, she said, "Hey, Lindsay, I looked at that and, let's connect on this. I see something there." And that was a really good feeling. Um, okay. Moving on, workforce is kind of a hot topic in post-secondary spaces these days. I know my institution, we have a workforce department, the New England Board of Higher Ed. I know we're in lots of conversations with institutions in our region about workforce development. So it's kind of like a new space where we as a community should be paying attention to and showing up. When we're thinking about workforce, if students are impacted by textbook costs in their workforce areas, like these stakeholders, they want and they need to know that. Um, Colleges and universities that have strong partnerships with them, um, they have a vested interest and they could potentially be an unexpected ally. So if we think about like there's a healthcare worker shortage, we know that students drop out of majors when they can't afford their textbooks. But others who aren't so close to the research like we are and who don't have students crying in their office asking for help because they can't afford their books, they just, naturally aren't going to make those connections. But we can make those connections for them, right? We can share those realities and experiences with them. Um, so if we do that, they can potentially become an ally. So I do think workforce is an area that, we as a community should be paying attention to. Students, I think, I put students and faculty at the bottom not because they are people that we don't need to think about, moving beyond the echo chamber. Um, but we as a community tend to talk about communicating with these two groups a lot. So I think, a lot has been said already, but you want to think about your student government associations. Ask to be invited to a meeting, give a presentation. Also, look for informal gatherings where students are. If you have student workers somewhere, like I know in my library, we have student workers and they are always at the circulation desk. I am constantly asking them questions about how they access their materials, what barriers they're running into. We had inclusive access kind of, come to our campus a few weeks ago, officially, and I asked them lots of questions about it. So, you need to show up in the spaces where students are, and listen to them, right? Make sure you focus the conversation on them and their experiences, and then make the connections to where you might be able to step in and take what you've learned to them and kind of move it up, to the senior leadership. And then when we talk about faculty, obviously we're talking about those one-on-one conversations we have with faculty. Librarians, we're really good at doing this. We meet with faculty on a regular basis for other things like information literacy instruction. But you also want to think about like faculty senate. Please show up to faculty senate. Please, even if you're just going to listen, if your institution has a senate body, like go. Ask to be invited. Make sure you have a sample resolution on OER. Make sure you have sample language available, stuff like that. Have a one pager. We have a chairs council at my institution, so all the department chairs meet once a month. I have gone there and talked about open. It's been really helpful. I have talked to our unions because we are unionized. Have helped them understand like the value of getting language put into contracts. So showing up at these spaces really matters. And one I don't have on the list, but I just wanted to quickly add is funders. So I think we all recognize I don't want to call it a crisis, but like the funders philanthropy right now in higher ed, like I feel like it's shrinking. Like government grants are shrinking, and funders are being inundated with more grant proposals from folks, that might not traditionally gone to them because there's less of them. So we really need to be strategic about getting in front of funders. And I think if you do have a relationship with a funder or you just are looking to establish one, it's really important to make sure that you understand their strategy well and you should be able to align it to your own. Um, and if you are currently funded, ask your grant officer if there are any philanthropy conferences that they recommend you present at. I'm going to talk about conferences in a minute, but I think it's important that, if you have the opportunity to be in those spaces where philanthropists are looking for things to care about and to fund, like we want to be there, we need to be there. It's very important. So, moving on to places, I think just it goes without saying, it's really important to do your homework on the culture, the values, and norms of any space that you show up in, hoping to talk about open. This will certainly allow for more nuanced, engaged, and thoughtful discussions. So I have another list of kind of like places that I think would be really helpful for us to kind of break out into. Um, and they're not all like, I think conferences is the big one for me, but like public hearings, I think, a lot of us might have the opportunity to testify, on a textbook affordability bill, or something else that is related directly or either indirectly to open. It's important that we rally each other and show up in these spaces. Get your peers, get your students, get your talking points together ahead of time and go and support bills that are being considered. The big one, I think on this slide right now, they're all really important, but the big one I think is conferences. I'm going to try really hard to see if I can paste this into the chat. Because I found a list of conferences it says to put on your radar. But I'm going to talk about some that, off the top of my head, I think are good spaces for us as a community to think about branching out into. I'm not sure if in the beginning I mentioned the SHIO conference, but it's the State Higher Education Executive Officers Conference. And SHIOs serve the chief executives of statewide governing policy and coordinating boards of post-secondary ed. That's where a lot of conversations are happening, and that's a really good space to be in. I know the compacts in general attend SHIO, but we decided as an open ed team within the compacts to also attend SHIO because no one else at SHIO is talking about open education. So we needed to be there and we needed to help those folks understand, what is going on the ground with their institutions that they are representing and supporting and helping them understand why they should be supporting and investing in open education. I think another really good one is the American Education Research Association. A lot of educators there, a lot of educators who might not even know what OER is are there. I mentioned in the beginning, I'm a graduate student right now. None of my faculty really knew what OER was, and I can confidently say that because I've paid a lot in textbooks in the last year. And I think I know a lot of them attend this conference specifically. And so if, we show up in a space where all of these faculty are going, we could have a significant impact in just raising awareness of open education and what we're trying to do on the ground. Um, you have your American Association of Community Colleges, ACRO, which is the registrar's conference. So, if you've engaged in course marking, team up with your registrar, submit a proposal, and, share your experience. It's really helpful to have an ally who is well respected among their peers, to team up with someone. So you're not just showing up, talking about something people might not attend that session, but if they see someone's name who they know and value and respect, they're more likely to show up. Elevators and hallways, always important. Quite literally and figuratively, you want to meet them where they are, meet them being any of these folks we've talked about. So that means, really trying to protect your elevator pitch. Doesn't have to be this literal elevator, but you get the point. So be prepared to have, a meaningful and engaging pitch in your back pocket. Keep your definitions and jargon kind of out of the picture here. You just wanna hook them, and then you want to ask for a follow-up conversation. So whether that's a Zoom or maybe in person, ask them to share their morning cup of coffee with you over Zoom and just ask for 10 minutes of their time. Okay, I'm going to start wrapping up here. Finally, I just wanted to say it's really important to leverage your network when we're talking about breaking out into these spaces where historically we haven't shown up. So don't be afraid to reach out to your colleagues and peers to pick their brains about how to connect with a specific population or decision maker. We can't do it all, right? We're not expected to know it all. So lean on your network, and jump on opportunities to share your message. Um, this summer, I was given the opportunity from a colleague who I used to work with at NEBI. They now work for Complete College America, and asked if I would share about Open on their podcast because when they arrived at Complete College America as a new employee, they talked about Open, and everyone was like, "What is that? Like, what is OER?" So it was a really great opportunity for me to share not only with their constituents, but now I have an artifact that I can share with my provost and I can share with my dean and say, hey, on your drive home today, can you listen to this? Like, that thing I've been trying to talk to you about? Like, here, you can listen to me talk about it. I just put a link in the chat. So, just kind of wrapping up, my final thoughts, don't get bogged down with jargon when you are talking to people about open who might not be as familiar. It's really tempting for me to geek out on copyright. I get it also. But we want to leave that stuff out. We want to leave out the 6 Creative Commons licenses. They're just not invited to the party initially. We want to engage them. So we want to ask them questions also to get a better sense of what their values and goals are. It's not just about what we want to bring to them. We need to know how can we help them, right? And then always ask if you can, send them an email or if you have 10 minutes of their time over Zoom to follow up and discuss. And that is all I have for you today. So I'm excited now to transition, so I can facilitate a conversation with our 3 panelists. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to find my questions. And while I do that, I'm going to ask the panelists to unmute and introduce themselves. Ethan, I see you first, so I'm going to ask you first and then just hand it off.
Hey everyone, it's good to see all of you, many familiar faces and many new faces. My name's Ethan. I worked, just really quickly, to summarize, I worked in the OER space for about 13 years. The last few years, I transitioned into working with a nonprofit that does free and fair elections administration work, which is slightly relevant in this day and age. So I'm excited to be here and join all of you.
Thanks, Ethan. Amanda.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Coolidge, and I have been in the open space for quite a number of years. And previous to the current role I'm in, I was Executive Director of BC Campus in British Columbia, Canada. And now I'm working with Pressbooks as their VP of Engagement, Strategic Engagement and Growth.
Wonderful. Liliana.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. My name is Liliana Diaz-Salarujan, and I'm a Senior Program Officer at Ascendium Education Group. But before that, I'd been in the open education space as I was a Senior Policy Analyst at the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education, and then at the Colorado Department of Higher Education.
Amazing. Liliana, I'm actually going to start with you if that's okay. Mhm. Can you describe a moment when you successfully brought open education into a room or community where it wasn't already known? And what do you think made that work?
Yeah, so I think one of the best examples was when I was at the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education, and WICHE has what they call a legislative advisory committee, where they bring legislators from the Western states that they support to just talk about higher education issues that are of importance to the field. And we had a convening of those legislators in Arizona, and I was able to bring some of the practitioners that are leading the charge in the work in open education in the state of Arizona to actually present to these legislators about open education. Some of those legislators are faculty themselves, or not legislators, but like policymakers and legislators too, have been faculty in the past and knew about some open education, but not like the whole ecosystem, right? They knew about like OER, but some of them hadn't heard of open pedagogy or open data or open access or all these other flavors of open that exist as well that can be really leveraged and used in our educational spaces. So it was really great to engage with these folks that were new to open, as well as those that have worked with some facet of open, to learn more about the work that was happening in Arizona. And so there was a lot of great questions. Many of those folks came up after the presentation to say, how can I get this work started in our state? Which for us, it was great because it's like that work is already happening in your state, but let's connect you so you can then carry the torch in some of these political spaces that they hadn't, that we sometimes don't have access to.
That's amazing. Thank you, Liliana. I remember when you had that meeting. It was exciting. Um, okay, I'm going to shift over to Amanda. Amanda, how do you decide which aspects of open education to lead with for a new audience? And what do you typically leave for later? So what's in and what's out?
I love this question. So one of the things that I always try to do with the new audience is really try to identify what is the problem they're trying to solve. So if I can identify that, then I usually can figure out how to have the conversation about where open might fit. One thing I always say to people when they're talking to new audiences is don't think of it as open education just as a general acronym. So, for example, with acronyms to an unknown audience, you often have to do quite a lot of explaining about what that acronym means. And so, frequently, what I will do is try to almost just even leave out some of the terms that we use in open education. So, for example, if I'm speaking to a new group of faculty who haven't heard of open pedagogy in the past, I never lead with open pedagogy. I always start talking to them about, are there ways that you could incorporate student co-creation or ways that students could contribute to this work? Eventually, as that conversation shifts, you sort of get to that point of, oh, by the way, this is called open pedagogy. But one of the other things that when we're talking about like workforce, or if you're talking to institutional administrators, one of the things that I like to bring up is this topic of retention. So, for example, I'll go with the institutional administrators first, is I always start, that's one concern right now is how to improve retention at institutions, because we know that then if you are able to maintain retention at an institution, you're able to improve the financial costs that students are contributing through years 1 to 4 and or 1 to 5 or whatever they're doing. And one of the things that I always like to equate is just talking about the accessibility and affordability aspect in relationship to that retention of students pursuing their degrees. Another thing that I also like to bring up, especially with workforce, is talking about how affordability and accessibility can often be the lever for students to take a look at multiple pathways in terms of stackable credentials. So, for example, if a student is interested in one particular micro-credential or one particular area of workforce development, how do we continue their interest without them having to put forward a significant amount of development, or sorry, resources, financial resources into their particular short course? And then lastly, with the workforce development, one thing we know is that a lot of the industry partners are looking for folks who can be employed on the spot, that they're looking for the industry to grow. And we know also that a lot of those industries have similar content across a number of different industries. So for example, if you think of the competency communication, communication is something that almost every every industry needs to be able to have those skills, that students need those skills. And so one thing I talk a lot about with workforce is how to create efficient systems of content development. And so meaning, how can you actually reuse some of the content that already exists out there so that your industry might be able to start getting students out there a little bit quicker. So that's sort of where I start. I didn't really finish with the what do you leave behind, but generally I'm kind of on your boat, Lindsay, which is don't start with the Creative Commons licenses, don't get into the jargon, and try to just sort of stay at the base level in terms of thinking about how it might be a response to what they're trying to solve.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important to just focus on the what's in right now, right? Um, so I have a follow-up to that, and I'm going to direct this to Liliana if that's okay. What language or framing has worked best for you when talking about open education to audiences outside the field, and what have you had to leave behind?
Yeah, and I want to bring attention to the chat as well because that conversation is happening right now, which is really great. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Amy, for that conversation. I think it really depends on the framing and the audience that you're engaged with at the time because the language that those folks speak is going to be different than the language that we speak. So, for example, if we're talking to administrators, like you said, Lindsay, in your presentation, they're bogged down with all of these other things that they have to tackle. And among those are, retention, persistence, regulatory pieces, things that they have to do for their state, SHIO agencies or for the legislature. There's all these things that they have to do that if we're talking about like, oh, for teaching and learning, that's great. But for them, it's like, that's within the purview of faculty, like just talk to me about what open can do about retention. What can it do for time to completion? Because that's what our legislators want. How do we get students through to get to their credentials? How do we tie it to workforce? So we need to understand who we're talking to and what they care about, and then reframe the conversation from open to something that matters to them. And I think it comes very well to like kind of what's in the chat that for some folks, OER doesn't mean anything to them. Open doesn't mean anything to them. But if we can say, well, it's about textbook affordability and not having students to choose between paying rent or buying food and being able to get their course materials free for them so they can then use that extra funding that they have to enroll in next semester or to be able to just have food in their stomach and then be able to concentrate in the classroom. Like that is a talking point that doesn't use like open or OER at all in that language, but really frames it as, student centered and being like student focused. If you're talking to like your institutional research folks, that's going to be a different conversation and different language that you're going to use. And you're going to want to bring like, what are the co-variables that they're going to need to understand if you're going to do research on open? For them, it's like if you don't have course marking on your campus, it might be difficult to pull that information out. So it would be working with faculty and your IR folks, your institutional research folks, to say, well, what is it that an IR person is going to need to run that type of analysis? Additionally, for a legislator that is interested about workforce development and industry and getting students into jobs, we can say, well, we can get students through their programs faster, or we can support them to get through their programs because they don't have to choose between buying textbooks and dropping the course because they're not going to have access to those textbooks or course materials. And I've actually kind of started to venture away from using the word textbook itself because as we're looking at the evolution of what instructional materials are in the classroom, it's so diverse. And so using the word textbook just kind of pigeonholes us into like these I would say antiquated like forms of educational materials that I just tend to use like course materials, educational materials that can include things that are openly licensed so everyone can use them, or just things that are accessible to all. And then I can bring examples of like videos, podcasts, you know, materials that were created by faculty that can be reused, and things like that. So just knowing your audience and the context and what they care about and tailoring the language to that. We might not know the language, but I feel like a Google search has helped me in the past. Is like, what do these people care about when it comes to higher education? And, it comes up with like a short list of things that they might care, and then we can focus on how to reframe the conversation.
I think it's so important. Everything you said. Yeah. And language, like something for me, language, our president at the community college, she's constantly saying, we need to put Pell dollars back into our students' pockets. We need to put the Pell dollars back into their pockets. And so that's been a really good opportunity for me to say, hey, OER can help us also put Pell dollars back into our students' pockets because they're not spending that financial aid on textbooks. They can spend it on, um, basic living supplies. And that has kind of turned some heads in the room where like usually their eyes glaze over when I start talking. So yeah, I think language is super key. And like you said, Liliana, it all comes back to just knowing our audience, right? Who are we speaking to? What do they care about? Okay, so we're doing pretty good on time. We have a few more questions that I'd like to ask. Amanda, if you don't mind, I'm going to go back to you. What fields or communities do you think are most ripe for open education right now, and why?
So I think one of the things that we need to be looking at is sort of you talked a little bit about it earlier about the funding concerns that are happening. And so if we can look at where is some of that funding happening and where can we sort of look at areas of integration. So for me, it's really looking at workforce in particular because of exactly what Liliana was talking about is where can we support students in getting into industry in a faster mechanism in a way that students feel like they don't have to, choose between rent and their resources. And also talking about this from, as I mentioned, from the workforce end is what does it look like to embed open education into some of this work where it might result in faster pathway development? So that's number one. Number two is I think dual enrollment is a really big area for us to be looking at where open can fit in this. If a student can start in a dual enrollment program without having to pay for those particular resources in order to move forward in their program, the assumption being that students then will continue in that program going forward. And again, that goes back to that whole retention conversation. And then another one, and I know we've talked about this multiple times, but sometimes I feel like our open education community is very higher ed focused. I really think that we need to also be focusing on the K through 12, encouraging our K through 12 advocates to really join in, especially in this community, and helping them advocate for that. With that, I also think there's a really great opportunity for open to be embedded more into teacher educator programs where I think we've done a lot of talking about that, but a lot less doing of it. And so if that's an opportunity for that audience, I think that's where we're going to be seeing a lot of funding mechanisms, especially in philanthropy going forward, is looking at ways that we can support the K through 12 education system in other ways. And I think that that might be sort of one of those steps. So for me, there's those three. It's the workforce, dual enrollment, and K through 12.
You heard it here first, folks.
Yeah.
Really, really great points. Ethan, I saved the best for last. So we have one question for you, Ethan. How can other spaces benefit from the learnings of OER? I think you have a lot to contribute here.
Thank you. And yeah, no pressure with that kind of lead up. So thank you. I love this topic and I love this question because, on one hand, working in OER, I remember having so many conversations about silos. And the majority of those conversations were about silos within education, which is its own whole beast to navigate and to deprogram. Um, but coming out of the headspace, very quickly, I have realized that all of that same parallel exists in other spaces, and within those spaces. And just like in education, the people and the structures and the places outside of our pre-existing silos would benefit so much from what you all know, from what you all do. And when I talk about that, on one hand, I think my first instinct is to consider the practices. So OER folks do a handful of things so exceptionally well that other spaces don't do. Community engagement, the idea of collective ownership and responsibility, public goods, continuous improvement. Um, these are all wonderful, wonderful practices. I just had a conversation like a few weeks ago about design sprints, which was like a new concept introduced to this cohort of organizations. And I'm just like, man, educators have been doing that forever. But it's not just the practices, it is also the principles. And this is something that I want to really distinguish because I think about, for example, the principle of not recreating the wheel. This is something that I 100% took for granted when I worked in OER. It's so intrinsic to the space, and it's something that, like, I think I totally lost sight of in between all the practical things, thinking about cost, thinking about accessibility, thinking about improvements in learning. But engaging with other spaces, looking, at the climate space or in the democracy space, whether it's, dozens of nonprofits creating toolkits that cover the same topics, or, the 10,000 election jurisdictions, that is how many independent election jurisdictions there are in the US, each creating their own poll worker training curriculum. This idea of not recreating the wheel is not necessarily an intrinsic or even on the radar value. And so I really wanted to take this opportunity to encourage this community, not just to think about the day-to-day piece, the practices, but to remember there is something so incredibly unique and so incredibly powerful in the principles of the work that you do that other spaces can benefit from deeply as well. And that's, I think, one of the greatest things that I would love to see this space export even more is that larger picture principle and perspective, that other groups don't have.
Absolutely. I think that kind of moral piece of like why we do what we do and sharing and how can we get others to adopt that principle is so important. And I'm seeing just in the chat right now, Kurt Newton building off of that, Ethan saying like creating open toolkits for community organizing, it seems very close to the work that we do and how can we kind of get that out there into spaces so we're not all recreating the wheel, right?
And that's so funny because there's this whole second tier of that. So that's translating benefits from, the education silo to other silos, but then also between silos. Like, Kurt, it's so awesome to see you because, like, I obviously loved working with you on OER, and I'm currently working with a whole other center just at MIT on election related stuff. And I'm like, man, I wonder how much they have talked with the other centers. And I'm sure you all have great communication and things like that. But the world is actually so much smaller than we often feel like it is. And the people doing this work are so much more closely related than we think. There is a ton of opportunity to share those principles and those practices kind of beyond this silo.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. We have about 10 minutes left, which is fantastic. So I'm just looking at, okay, so we can take questions in the chat. So if anyone has questions, I can read them off. And then our panelists can put their collective minds together to help us discuss it. So if anyone wants to throw a question in the chat or panelists, if you see anything in the chat, just a discussion that you wanted to bring up, let's do it. I'm gonna give like 20 seconds to let something organically happen, and then we'll shift.
So one thing I would say is if you're at an institution that is having conversations about micro-credential development, a lot of times I've noticed that micro-credential development conversation is happening in a continuing education department. That's what we would call it in Canada. So like a continuing studies department. And a lot of times there is this idea, and I put it in the chat, there's this idea that they don't want to be using open resources because to them, they have always equated that with free. That is a free content that you are just giving out to anybody. And my rationale behind, or my thinking behind that is you don't actually have, like, the content does not have to necessarily be free, but if you can use open resources in order to help with some of that content development or some of that content dissemination, the better, right? That's going to help students go through, as we talked about, go through that pathway. At the end of the day, the purpose behind the micro-credential and what gives it value is that you get the credential. And so you still have to, as a student, pay for that credential. So I think one thing to think about as when you have those conversations with folks in that area of your organization, I think it's important to sort of provide that context to folks.
Mm-hmm. And I think I'll jump in to just build on what Amanda was saying, but like, at least in the United States context, we have a lot of shortages in many critical areas of industry. And one of the things that the arguments is that, well, some of these associations have their own proprietary materials that then the learner has to buy to get that credential, right? They have to study for that exam or licensure. But in a setting where we have such a shortage of folks in those fields, could the argument not be made? It's like, do you want the learner to get this credential so there's more of this X person, people in this industry? Or is it more important to have that learner pay for your proprietary instructional materials? Like, I think we also need to be having some of those more critical conversations of like, pick your poison, I guess, in a sense. What is more important to you? Filling in these vacancies or charging for these learner materials that will exclude some folks from actually engaging with you in that industry. So, and that's a conversation that could be had with that association of X industry or with state legislatures to say, is there a way to subsidize or leverage folks into that industry by being able to support some of the materials that are required for the learning in preparation for that licensure or that credential exam, whatever it might be.
I think that's such an important point, Liliana, to like we need to somehow connect with industry to help them understand like the barriers that, there's a worker shortage, and one of the reasons may be because, there are financial barriers for students either paying to take the exam, paying for the materials to study for the exam, or whatever else it may be. And what can we all do together to remove those barriers? Can open play a role? Like you said, kind of pick, you have to pick. You can't be both. But there needs to be a strategy to show up in those spaces where these industry leaders are to have these conversations, right? Yeah, excellent.
I would just really quickly add too, I think this is especially important thinking about reaching across boundaries in the context that you described earlier, which is that, there's obviously a crisis happening in higher education. There are funding challenges. The more that we are reaching out and widening the lens, the more we are engaging different potential fields to tap into, right? Like there is a lot of money being invested in the democracy space right now. For example, there's a very good reason for that. But right, that can open up some ground too. Like I'm even thinking about micro-credentialing and, like talking about poll worker training programs. I would wager that in most jurisdictions have never talked to an instructional designer, never mind thought about micro-credentialing their programs or how they're managing their resources or any of that. So, that's a potentially new ground to break, which can help escape a little bit from this sort of closed net system of education. That I think is relevant to exactly the things you all are talking about.
Absolutely. Let's see. Do any of you have kind of maybe just one final closing piece of advice for everyone here who might be looking to reach out about an issue, open education or otherwise? I know we've kind of talked about like really knowing your audience. It's a two-way street. Like we have something we want them to care about, but we really do need to take the time to learn about what they care about. How can we support them, even if it's not with open? Relationship building is a key aspect here, I think.
Yeah, I think I'll just say for me, it goes back to what I said in the beginning, is really trying to identify what problem they're trying to solve. And to then build upon what Ethan was saying is to look at what the problem they're trying to solve and try to identify what open education principles might best support that particular problem.
That's a great point. Liliana, do you have any kind of closing thoughts?
Um, I think one of the things, oh, oh,
There we go. Okay. Thank you. Trying to balance two
yeah.
locations here. I think one of the things that folks forget is that individuals have a lot of power. Um, and our voices matter, and who we talk to and how we frame things can have a big impact, even if we don't see that quickly. But one of the examples that I think kind of goes to Amanda's previous like token of wisdom is like one of the examples is like our chief financial officers at our institutions are citing, they're the ones signing some of these like procurement packages without understanding that they have another option because they don't know that there's another option. So what would it look like for our faculty senates to say, hey, if you're signing this, you really should be talking to our faculty senate because we're the ones that really should be in power of instructional materials that we use. So I think that's critical, important to know that we have power. And if us as an individual aren't like confident that we have that power, look at the organizations or the memberships that we have that do and can leverage some power.
That's a great point. Ethan, any final thoughts?
Just that the potential impact that you all have and the value that you all have is incredible when it comes to education. And I know that, like, no, I know the benefits that folks have for their students, for their learners, and that's so real. But I also just the amount of benefit that you can have and the impact that you can have in other ways too is so amazing. So don't forget that.
That's an excellent point to end on. Thank you so much. So I think we are about at time. Um, Aisha, would you like to close us out, or would you like me to do that?
That's yeah, that we're at time. Thank you so much to our amazing panelists and to Lindsay for the presentation. Really appreciate you all joining us and taking time out of your Wednesday to learn more about this. You will receive an email when the recording is posted, as well as a link to the slides. And really appreciate you all, and thank you so much to our panelists and presenter. I learned so much today, so thank you all so much.
Thank you. Have a good rest of the day.